Well, I'm Joel Scandrette, professor of historical theology here at Trinity School for Ministry and director of the Robert Webber Center, which hosts this annual Ancient Evangelical Future Conference. The motto of the Webber Center is Reclaiming the Christian Tradition for the Life of the Church Today. And this evening's event is a session of this year's Ancient Evangelical Future Conference in which we're considering the theme of medieval wisdom. It's also, though, an open public lecture, and many of you are here in that capacity, so welcome. We look forward to a wonderful time together this evening. Our guest speaker tonight, as you know, is Rod Dreher. It goes without saying that Rod is widely known as a social and religious commentator. He's an Orthodox Christian, a blogger at the American and senior editor at the American Conservative, and author of several books, including Crunchy Cons, How Dante Can Save Your Life, and of course, most recently, The Benedict Option, a Strategy for Christians in a Post-Christian Nation. I invited Rod to join us for this conference some time ago, well before the publication of The Benedict Option. So I have to say, it's been quite an amazing thing to observe. If I'd known it was going to be such a big deal, I would have doubled our advertising budget. There you go. As a convinced McIntyrean myself, I was already aware of Rod's work and popularization of Alistair McIntyre's Ben Op, but I had no idea the firestorm of reaction that this book would generate. I won't attempt to describe the various caricatures of Rod's position. I think it's fair to call a lot of it caricatured that I've seen bandied about on social media since the release of this book. Of those I've actually read, there have only been a few that I think actually get what Rod is trying to get us to in this book. But thankfully, we don't have to wait through that because Rod's here to answer all your questions. But I think one thing is clear: as a result of the furor, we need to give Rod a new title. So I propose that he henceforth be known as Lightning Rod Dreher. Rod's talk tonight. That's why I'm doing this. Rod's talk tonight is entitled, Why the Church in America Needs the Benedict Option. And Rod, it's a delight to welcome you to Trinity.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. I'm glad to hear this is a big group. I mean, maybe I shouldn't have tweeted out that there was going to be free beer after the talk, but anyway, I'm glad to see that you all haven't run for the hills and built your compound like I told you to do. Let me begin with a trigger warning for the faint of heart. If what I'm about to say alarms you, well, it sounds like I'm trying to alarm you, that's because I am. We live in alarming times, and our refusal or inability to recognize this only makes the church more vulnerable to the dangers around us. If you're a faithful Christian and you're not alarmed by what's happening today, I think you're failing to read the signs of the times. Last summer in the region around Baton Rouge, where I live, the weather forecast one August weekend called for heavy rain. The weather system did something unpredictable. It stalled over the area and dumped something like 36 inches of rain in a 2.5-day period. This caused a 1,000-year flood, inundating vast areas of the capital region that had never in history seen flooding. Tens of thousands of people lost their homes and had to be evacuated with the water rising all around them. I spent that Sunday morning at a shelter in Baton Rouge, helping the evacuees come in, helping them get fed, get settled. It was really a great thing to see. So many people in the churches in Baton Rouge just turned out to help. Everybody we saw that came in off the helicopters or in the trucks or whatever, they were completely stunned. They had never imagined that anything like this could happen to them because it never had. I believe we Christians in the West are facing our own 1,000-year flood, or if you believe Pope Benedict XVI, a 1,500-year flood. In 2012, the then pontiff said that the spiritual crisis overtaking the West is the most serious since the fall of the Roman Empire near the end of the 5th century. For a pope, the leader of 1 billion Roman Catholics around the world, to say something like that, that's huge. Pope Benedict was right. even as the Christian faith spreads in the global south and in China, the light of Christianity is flickering out all over the West. The West has become post-Christian. For a long time, we Christians have downplayed or ignored the signs. Others of us have confined our thinking about such things to the fever swamps of popular apocalypticism, which is worse than useless when it comes to addressing the actual spiritual crisis we're in. My wife is raised in a sort of a fundamentalist background in Texas, North Texas, and she said there were actually people who she knew who believed it didn't matter what we did because the Lord was about to come back any second now, so he may as well just not plan for the future. Well, now the floodwaters are upon us, and we're not ready. The storm clouds have been gathering for decades, but most of us believers have operated under the illusion that they would blow over. For most of my adult life, many Christian conservatives, and I'm guilty of this myself, thought that strengthening the levees of law and politics would keep the flood of secularism at bay and allow us to take back the culture for Christ, to use a phrase popular among the old school religious right. Today, we can see that Christian conservatives, or as I prefer to call us to get the political angle out, small o Orthodox Christians, we've lost on nearly every front. The swift and relentless currents of secularism have overwhelmed our flimsy barriers. The public square has largely been lost. I do not claim that the world is coming to an end. No man knows the day or the hour. What I am claiming is a world is coming to an end, and that if Christians don't take radical action now, the faith that made Western civilization will not survive for long into its post-Christian phase. Well, what are the signs of the times then? After all, here in the West, we're living in a time of unprecedented peace and prosperity, though I hardly need to point out the mounting sense of political crisis in the United States and Europe. But signs of our spiritual depletion are impossible to deny. And if we are spiritually depleted and morally exhausted, then our peace and prosperity and order will not long last. I won't recite for you a litany of statistics tonight, but I do want to focus on a few that are of particular interest to Christians. The Christian faith is flat on its back in Europe. The United States, on the other hand, has long been thought of as a counterexample to the secularization thesis, the idea that with modernity comes secularization. Well, it happened in Europe, but it didn't really happen in America. But now that thesis has been disproved. It's no longer tenable for America. Writing last year in the American Journal of Sociology, scholars David Voas and Mark Chavez say the data now show that the U.S. is on the same downward path to disbelief pioneered by our European cousins. They base this on data showing that despite the fact that America is more religious than Europe in general, with each passing generation, the numbers have declined. With the millennial generation, the bottom has dropped out. According to the Pew Research Center, 1 in 3 18 to 29-year-olds have put religion aside if they ever picked it up in the first place. Those younger Americans who remain affiliated in some capacity with the churches have been formed by a pseudo-religion that resembles Christianity in name only. Notre Dame sociologist Christian Smith and his colleagues have called this moralistic therapeutic deism. I'm sure you've heard of it. MTD uses the language and the conceptual vocabulary of historical biblical Christianity, but in fact it teaches a malleable, feel-good, Jesus-light philosophy perfectly suited to a consumerist, individualistic, post-Christian society that worships the self, not God. Smith and his research colleagues found that MTD is the de facto religion of most young Americans today. And I would say that it has been the de facto religion of most Americans for much longer than that. What are the consequences of MTD? In findings published in 2011, Christian Smith found that among 18 to 23-year-old Christians surveyed, only 40% said that their personal moral beliefs were grounded in the Bible or some other religious sensibility. An astonishing 61% of these so-called emerging adults said they have a moral problem with materialism and consumerism. An added 30% expressed some qualms about materialism and consumerism, but said it was not worth worrying about. In other words, let me make sure I got that right. 61% said no problem at all with materialism and consumerism. 30% said, yeah, it's a problem, but we can't do anything about it, so we're not going to worry about it. Only 9% of these Christians, self-identified Christians, said that materialism and consumerism conflict with the Christian faith. In this view, the view of the majority, the clear and overwhelming majority, said Smith, all that society is apparently is a collection of autonomous individuals out to enjoy life. In an interview for my book, The Benedict Option, Christian Smith told me, America has lived a long time off its thin Christian veneer, partly necessitated by the Cold War. That is all finally being stripped away by the combination of mass consumer capitalism and liberal individualism. The Marxist sociologist Zygmunt Bauman hatched a concept that perfectly captures the conditions of our time and place: liquid modernity. The modern period is characterized by a conscious break with the authority of the past and its institutions. For Zygmunt Bauman, solid modernity describes the first phase of modernity, in which the pace of change had quickened, but was still slow enough for people to adjust. Things still seemed more or less solid. This was how it was in the Enlightenment, through the Enlightenment, and at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But now we've moved into liquid modernity, a time in which the pace of change is so rapid that nothing, no new institutions, no new habits, no new customs, has time to solidify before it changes again. In liquid modernity, Bauman said, the most successful person is the one who has no allegiances beyond himself and his own self-interest, not to a person, not to a church, not to a God, not to an institution, only the self. He can change loyalties and beliefs at will to suit his own preferences, adjusting to the changing conditions. There is no solid ground anymore. Well, from a Christian perspective, I liken liquid modernity to the great flood of the Bible. All the familiar landmarks of our faith are being submerged and swept away. The flood cannot be turned back. The best we can do, I believe, is to construct arcs within which we can ride it out, and by God's grace, make it across this dark sea of time to a future when we find dry land again and can start the rebuilding, the reseeding, and the renewal of the earth for Christ. What is the Benedict option, and what does it have to do with this dire scenario I paint? Well, the term comes from the famous final paragraph of Alistair MacIntyre's 1981 book, After Virtue. In that book, the philosopher explained how Enlightenment modernity overthrew the old traditional sources of moral order, rooted in Christianity and classical philosophy. But it couldn't produce an authoritative, binding replacement for it. The West, therefore, has been unraveling for some time now, and in MacIntyre's view, is reaching a point of reckoning. Liberalism is not sufficient to do the necessary work of binding society together and giving its members purpose. And to be clear, by liberalism, I mean the philosophy and the order that all of us live in, whether we're Democrats or Republicans. You know, classical liberalism is the society in which we live, but it can't hold society together, says MacIntyre. In his book's conclusion, MacIntyre too compared our present time to Rome's collapse like the Pope did, though he indicated that our wealth obscures from our eyes the fragility of everything around us. In post-imperial times, he said, some men and women of virtue quit trying to shore up the imperium, that's his phrase, meaning the existing social order, and instead focused on building new forms of community within which they could live out their moral traditions within the ruins of civilization, Roman civilization. MacIntyre famously said that today we await a new and doubtless very different Saint Benedict. Benedict of Nursia is known today as the founder of Western monasticism and as one of the patron saints of Europe. He was born around the year 480, 4 years after the last Roman emperor abdicated, and was sent down to the city of Rome as a pious young man to complete his education. What he saw there unnerved him, disgusted him. The chaos, the decadence, the lack of civil order. Benedict lit out for the forest to pray and to fast and to seek God's will for his life. Eventually, he founded 12 monasteries, 12 or 13 monasteries, governed by a monastic constitution we know today as the Rule of St. Benedict. The Rule is a thin, plain pamphlet for the running of a monastery, which Benedict called a school for the Lord's service. It's not a book of spiritual secrets. I remember when I got it for the first time, I thought it would be like the Philokalia or some like mystical sayings of the Desert Fathers. Not at all. This is meat and potatoes, plain. This is what you do. This is how you do it to run a monastery. It just tries to set out an order for living in community for the sake of training monastics in the spiritual life. You would never guess from reading this plain little book the role it played in preserving Christianity in the post-Roman West and, in fact, saving Western civilization. After Benedict died, monasticism exploded in Western Europe. Monks moved all over. They brought the faith to unchurched people. They taught them how to pray, but they also taught them how to grow things and make things and do things, practical everyday things, knowledge that had been forgotten when Rome collapsed. In their rituals and in their libraries, the monks kept alive the faith, but they also kept alive the cultural memories of the civilization of which they had witnessed the collapse. Because they took a vow of stability, a sacred promise to remain in the monastery where they took their vows until the end of their lives, peasants would gather around those monasteries as citadels of light and order and tranquility through a very, very chaotic and difficult time. In this way, the Benedictine monasteries were arcs of carrying the faith across the stormy waters of the Dark Ages. It all happened not because St. Benedict set out to make Rome great again, but because he sought out how to best serve the Lord in community during a terrible crisis. In other words, he didn't say, how are we going to save what we have? It's like, how do I serve the Lord? Where is the Lord to be found in this time and in this place? And his answer was through the Rule of St. Benedict and through monasticism. Everything else followed from that. Well, in my book, The Benedict Option, I write about my visits to the Benedictine monastery in Norcia, as St. Benedict's hometown is known today. I interviewed the monks there. There are about 15 or 16 monks, most of them Americans, about how their core values and practices can be applied to everyday Christian life outside the monastery. Prayer, work, hospitality, asceticism, stability, community. In Benedictine daily life, all these things work together in balance and harmony to lead the monks toward a sense of life-giving order, suffused by the sure knowledge of the sacredness of life and the fact that God is everywhere present and fills all things. Father Cassian Folsom, who was at the time I was there, the prior of the monastery, or the leader, told me that the monastery and its life of Christ-focused prayer is a sign of contradiction to the modern world. Quote, "The guardrails have disappeared and the world risks careering off a cliff," he told me, "but we're so captured by the lights and the motion of modern life that we don't recognize the danger. The forces of dissolution from popular culture are too great for individuals or families to resist on their own. We need to embed ourselves in stable communities of faith," close quote. Well, what does this look like for ordinary Christians, Catholic and otherwise, who are called to live in the world as we are? Does the Benedict Option call for Christians to head for the hills and build the high walls to keep the impurity of the world at bay? Not at all. We have to evangelize as Christians, or we fail the Great Commission. We have to serve our neighbors, or we fail to serve the Lord. Put all thoughts of total withdrawal out of your mind. That's not what the Benedict Option calls for. But it does call for what I've termed a strategic separation from the everyday world. What do I mean by that? I mean that we have to erect some walls, metaphorical walls, so to speak, between ourselves and the world for the sake of our own spiritual formation and discipleship. In this hedonistic post-Christian society, the dissipating forces of the outside culture, of popular culture, they're overwhelming. We cannot expect to go out from church into the public square and keep our candle lit, the light of Christ lit, any more than we could leave the church in a gale force wind and do so. We have to have preparation. We have to know what we're going out into. We have to be formed in strong ways to be able to bear the light of Christ into the public square in this gale. And so here's the paradox of the Benedict Option. If the church is going to be the blessing for the world that God means for it to be, then the church is going to have to spend more time away from the world, deepening its commitment to God, to Scripture, to prayer, to tradition, and to each other. We cannot give the world what we don't have. We should engage with the world, but not at the expense of our fidelity and discipleship and our sense of ourselves as a people set apart. Let me use a couple of examples from the Bible to illustrate what I mean. In Jeremiah 29, the Lord, speaking through the prophet Jeremiah, tells his people Israel in their Babylonian exile to settle in the city and to integrate into its life. But the Lord also warns, quote, "Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord." Well, what is this about? In the exile community, there were would-be prophets who told the Jewish people exactly what they wanted to hear, but it was a comforting lie. Jeremiah, though, was a true prophet. We might say that because he lived outside the exile community, he could hear the Lord's voice more clearly. Well, somehow the Jews in exile had to figure out how to obey God's command to integrate into Babylonian society while at the same time not being assimilated. In the book of Daniel, we read the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, 3 Jews who were state officials under King Nebuchadnezzar. You can't get more integrated than that. But when the king ordered all his officials to bow down before a false idol, those 3 men refused, even on pain of death. As we all know from the story, the king threw them into the blazing fire, which did not consume them. Nebuchadnezzar then repented and restored them to their position. Well, how did they do it? How did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego live lives that were integrated into Babylon, but also develop such a strong faith that they were willing to lose everything, even their lives, before bowing to an idol? That is the question facing Christians today in our own Babylonian exile here in post-Christian America. We have to somehow walk a path between the Christian fundamentalist who reject everything about the world and the accommodationist who love the world so much that they rationalize idol worship for the sake of preserving our privileges and our social status. Engaging the culture must never become an excuse to burn a pinch of incense to Caesar. Winsomeness must never be a veil concealing our cowardice from ourselves. There must have been something about the daily lives of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Babylon that trained them spiritually so that when they were put to the ultimate test, they passed. It has to be that way with us too. We're failing at this today, we in the church, and we're failing badly. The numbers I cited earlier in this talk from social science tell a tale of Christian infidelity. If we don't change our way of living, we're not going to survive as the church. We will be assimilated. There's no middle way. The Lord promised that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church, but he didn't promise that they would not prevail against his church in the United States or in the West. That's up to us and our own fidelity. In the Benedict option, I talk about various ways that we can and should do this, things we might do to strengthen our witness and strengthen our discipleship so we can not only endure but bear witness to a lost people in a dark time. I write about education. I write about the workplace. I write about prayer and worship, family, community, the way we use technology, and the way we approach sex and sexuality. There's no time tonight to go into all of those, but I do want to say a few words about one area that is on everybody's mind right now, and that's politics. As I was writing this book, like everybody in this room, I suspect, I expected Hillary Clinton to win the presidency. Had that happened, the future of religious liberty would have been very bleak. It didn't happen, though. But today I hear a lot of my conservative Christian friends breathing a sigh of relief, as if Donald Trump's victory signaled an all clear. Don't believe it, not for 1 second. Even if Donald Trump were a saint, he could not turn back the cultural tsunami of liquid modernity. The crisis we face is far beyond the power of politics. If America had elected a cross between Pericles and Billy Graham, we would still need the Benedict option. And I should point out, I was writing about the Benedict option a decade before the Obergefell decision. If same-sex marriage did not exist, we would still need the Benedict option. Because the core problem is not gay people or liberal Democrats or Muslim immigrants or the white working class or anybody else. The core problem is a culture and a civilization that has abandoned Christian orthodoxy. The problem is a church that has become lukewarm and assimilated to the culture. The problem is us. Recovering and rebuilding the world we have lost is going to be the work of centuries. I believe that we have to stay active in conventional politics, working as we are able for the common good, and especially fighting to preserve religious liberty. But we cannot make the same mistake as the prior generation of religious conservatives. This is a mistake that I'm old enough to have made myself. We thought, the problem was that American culture was fundamentally moral, and that if our side could just capture political and judicial offices, we could restore the republic to its proper moral footing. They were wrong. We were wrong. I was wrong. Republicans kept winning, but that was a fact that obscured the long, steady loss of the culture. I believe that politics in the Benedict option should be localist and small c Catholic in its scope. It is more important for us right now as Christians to strengthen churches, to start schools, and build up a local community, not just the Christian community, but our local communities, than it is to shore up the imperium. I want America to prosper, but it is far more important to be a faithful Christian than it is to be a good American. Do I worry about persecution for the church? To an extent, I do. You just can't talk to law professors, doctors, professors, and others who follow the religious liberty debate and remain calm and sanguine about the future. Pastors and parents who do not prepare those under their authority for that kind of future are failing in their duty. But as I see it, the greater problem right now for the church in America is not coming from the outside, but from the inside, via the steady erosion of authentic Christianity, by the restlessness of individualism, of hedonism, and consumerism. And this is where the example of the Benedictine monks can be so helpful to us. The Benedictine life is built on principles that all of us can emulate, even though we don't live in thick monastic community. What did the Benedictines offer us? In my book, I write about a pilgrimage I made to that monastery in Norcia, the hometown of Benedict and his sister Scholastica. As I said, there are about 15 monks there, most of them Americans, living a traditional Benedictine life. Several of them sat down with me at February of 2016 to explain to me the basic principles ordering their life together in Christ. Well, first, Benedictine monasticism shows us the realism about the human condition. Father Cassian Folsom, the prior, said that the rule of St. Benedict is not made for spiritual superheroes, but for weak people who need help staying focused. All of us need some form of spiritual discipline to keep ourselves on track, and we all need each other to help each other do this. Second, and most important, the Benedictines model a life built around sacred order, the very thing missing from our post-Christian society. If a defining characteristic of the modern world is disorder, then the most fundamental act of cultural resistance is to establish order. If we don't have internal order, I'm not talking about the police on the streets, but if we don't have internal order, we will be controlled by our human passions and by the powerful who are in greater control of directing modernity's deep currents. And if we don't have inner order, we are going to see more and more policemen on the streets to try to keep the civil order. For the traditional Christian, then, establishing internal order is not merely a matter of discipline, nor is it simply an act of the will. Rather, it's what Catholic theologian Romano Guardini called man's efforts to regain his right relation to the truth of things, to the demands of his own deepest self, and finally, to God. This means the discovery of the order, the logos, that God has written into the nature of creation and seeking to live in harmony with it. It also implies the realization of natural limits within creation's givenness, as opposed to believing that nature is something we can deny or refute or change according to our own desires. And finally, it does mean disciplining one's life to live for the glory of God and for the service of others. Order is not simply, as I said earlier, a matter of law and its enforcement. In the classical Christian view, the law itself depends on a deeper, transcendent conception of order, an idea of the way ultimate reality is constructed. This order may be unseen, but it is believed and internalized by those living within the community that professes it. The point of life for individuals, for the church, and for the state, ideally, is to pursue harmony with that transcendent eternal order. To order the world rightly as Christians requires regarding all things, everything around us, as pointing to Christ, as an icon of God. Chapter 19 of the Rule of St. Benedict offers a succinct example of the connection between a disciplinary teaching and the unseen order. In it, Benedict instructs his monks to keep their minds focused on the presence of God and his angels when they are engaged in chanting the divine office, which he called the Opus Dei, or the work of God. We believe that the divine presence is everywhere and that the eyes of the Lord are looking on the good and the evil in every place, writes Benedict. But we should believe this especially without any doubt when we are assisting at the work of God. He concludes with an admonition to remember that when they pray the Psalms together, they are standing in the presence of Almighty God and must pray, quote, in such a way that our mind may be in harmony with our voice. Every monk's life and all his labors must be directed to God's service. The rule teaches that God must be the beginning and the end of all our actions. To bound our spiritual passions by the rhythm of daily life and its disciplines, and to do so with others in our family and in our community, is to build a strong foundation of faith within which one can be fully human, become fully human and fully Christian. This is not some esoteric, woo-woo, mystical spiritual teaching. This is basic Christianity and was for most of its existence. But this is the sort of thing that we have forgotten in modern times. So this belief in sacred order is one of the things that binds the monastic community together. When a community, any community, does not share belief in foundational objective truths, it risks becoming undone. And this, again, is at the core of our problem in late modernity. The Benedictines of Norcia are Roman Catholics. The magisterium of the Catholic Church is their guide. These monks do not argue among themselves about whether or not to accept this or that hard teaching of the Church. They do accept it. They do not have to reinvent the moral wheel at every turn. We Christians who are not Catholics, I'm Eastern Orthodox, obviously don't live by the Roman Church's teachings. But if we do not anchor ourselves in submission to some binding authority beyond ourselves, we too will be torn apart, and our communities will be torn apart by the strong currents of liquid modernity. This is not just a set of ideas we carry around in our heads. We have to make them real. We have to incarnate them in the practices of our daily lives. Father Cassian explained to me that the Rule of St. Benedict is just a plain, simple guidebook for how to make that faith incarnate in community. He told me, a rule channels your spiritual energy, your work, your activity, so that you're able to accomplish something. Monastic life is very plain, he continued. People from the outside have perhaps a romantic vision, perhaps what they see on television of monks sort of floating around the cloister. There is that, he said, and it's attractive, but basically, monks get up in the morning, they pray, they do their work, they pray some more. They eat, they pray, they do some more work, they pray some more, and then they go to bed. It's rather plain, just like most people. The genius of St. Benedict, he said, is to find the presence of God in everyday life. There you have it. The genius of St. Benedict is to find and make real the presence of God in everyday life. In our morning prayer, we in the Eastern Orthodox Church address a heavenly King who is, as I said earlier, everywhere present and filleth all things. When in the Rule, St. Benedict instructs his monks to treat even their tools as if they were sacred vessels of the altar, we understand that the saint is acknowledging the Lord's presence in all creation and instructing his monks to abide by that truth. People who are anxious, confused, and looking for answers are quick to search for the solutions in the pages of books or on the internet, looking for that killer app that's going to solve all our problems and make everything right again. The Rule of St. Benedict says, no, it's not like that. You can achieve the peace and order that you seek only by making a place within your heart and within your daily life for the grace of God to take root. Divine grace is freely given, but God will not force us to receive it. It takes constant effort on our part to get out of God's way and let His grace into our souls, our hearts and souls, to heal us and change us. To the end, what we think does not matter. To this end, what we think does not matter as much as what we do and how faithfully and regularly we do it. Think about it. A man who wants to get in shape and has read the best bodybuilding books will get nowhere unless he applies that knowledge in eating healthy food and working out daily. That takes sustained willpower. In time, if he's faithful to the practices necessary to achieve his goal, that man will love eating well and exercising so much that he's not pushed to do it by exercising willpower and by strict obedience, but rather he's drawn to it by love. He will have trained his heart to love the right thing and to desire the good. Note well what this is not. I mean, this is what the Benedictines do, but note well what it's not. This is not a strategy for mastering theological arguments. It's something more basic than that. It's a strategy for taking those arguments and embedding them, these truths and arguments, and embedding them in a web of practices that imprint them onto one's heart. As the Trappist monk Thomas Merton warned, and that I learned myself the hard way, if your conversion is only intellectual, then it is precarious. Only when it begins to change your heart does your conversion take root. A third gift the Benedictines offer us is stability. When you become a Benedictine monk, you're obliged to remain in that monastic community in which you made your final profession until the day you die. That could change for some reason. Say the abbot sends you and some others to start a daughter house. But most of the time, you stay right there because that's the community to which you made your vow. This is called stability. And I think this could well be one of the most countercultural aspects of Benedictine practice today. We lack stability. We take it as normal that people will move around a lot in search of a good job or a fulfilling career. I did this myself. St. Benedict knew that for most of us, though, spiritual growth can only happen under conditions of stability. A plant cannot put down roots and grow if it is constantly being pulled out of the soil and transplanted elsewhere. In his rule, Benedict said that the worst kind of monk is the gyrovague, a monk who flits from monastery to monastery, taking what he can before moving on to the next one. This kind of monk is a spiritual tourist, not a pilgrim, and he's never going to get anywhere. In the modern world, we have created conditions in which the gyrovague, the worst kind of monk, is a hero. Remember, Zygmunt Bauman said in Liquid Modernity, the one who commits to something and stays put is a fool. He can't succeed because we've set up the world where those who are stable are at a disadvantage. But to succeed today, you need to be free of all commitments, unbound by the past or future, and living in an everlasting present. The world changes so quickly that those who do anchor themselves in commitment to a spouse, a church, or whatnot, or a place, and who is loyal to anything, you take an enormous risk. Only commit yourself to maximizing personal happiness, and you will be fine. Well, no Christian can live this way. You may gain the world, but you will lose your immortal soul. Seen through the eyes of faith, and by the light of the rule of St. Benedict, modern life in liquid modernity is hellish. We have to resist it. Our faith gives us an anchor for our journey across that turbulent sea when we stop to rest, and it gives us a map and a rudder to make sure we are going the right way when we move. We must never forget that we are called to be pilgrims, not tourists. The pilgrim's journey has transcendent meaning. It may be harrowing at times, but the pilgrim is going somewhere definite, and he is being sanctified with every step forward. The tourist is only out for amusement and pleasure. Boredom is the root of all evil for the tourist. I'm sorry to say that far too often we Christians give people the impression that life in Christ is a tourist holiday, not a holy pilgrimage. Committing ourselves to workable forms of stability in our own circumstances fights against this. A fourth gift of the Benedictines is practices that sanctify. As Father Cassian indicated, a monk's life is pretty simple: prayer, scripture study, prayer, work, sleep, and so forth. Over time, though, those simple practices faithfully adhered to train the body and the soul to harmonize with the Lord's will. For the Benedictines, all of life, everything you do, is meant to be a prayer. As Father Basil of Norcia told me, when one advances in prayer, one learns that prayer is not so much about asking God for things as it is about simply being in His presence. When the monks pray specifically, they pray with their entire selves. Father Cassian told me, we sing when we pray, we stand, we sit, we bow, we kneel, we prostrate. The body is very much involved in prayer. It's not just some kind of intellectual meditation, and that's important, close quote. The monks also practice asceticism, a word not often used in Christian life today. It comes from the Greek word askesis, meaning training. The idea is to give up certain comforts in the body to train the will to place spiritual realities and the Word of God first. Ascetic practices include most commonly fasting. Periodic fasting during penitential seasons, that's been an ordinary Christian practice since the beginning of Christianity. Jesus fasted, but it is one that has fallen out of use in the modern world. We should reclaim it. Fasting serves to remind us in our own bodies about the primacy of sacred order. The monks also treat their manual labor as somehow participating in God's creative action in the world. We in the laity may not engage in monkish labors like brewing beer, alas, but we can and should join them in seeing the work that God has given us to do in our own vocations as an offering to God. If we seek to restore wholeness to our fragmented and compartmentalized modern lives, we have to reclaim the idea that all of life belongs to Christ, even the workplace. Finally, the monks offer us the gift of showing hospitality. If anybody knows anything about the Benedictine monks, chances are that it is that St. Benedict orders his monks to treat strangers who show up at their door as if they were Christ himself. Though monks live largely cloistered lives, the practice of hospitality allows them to share from their own bounty, spiritual and otherwise, with the outside world. In the same way, our own parishes and communities need to be hospitable and welcoming to all comers. We can't be closed in on each other with our backs to the world at all times. But there is an important limit to hospitality. The monks are really wise about this. They say that the only way we can be for the pilgrims that come to them at the monastery what Christ calls them as monks to be is to spend a lot of time away from the public in prayer and contemplation. If they kept the monastery doors wide open and put up no barriers between themselves and the public, they would never be able to do the kind of spiritual training that helps them fulfill their specific calling as monks. The stranger is welcome in the monastery, but the stranger cannot be allowed to disrupt the rhythm of the monastery's life and come between the monk and the service of God. A school for the Lord's service could get no teaching done at all if people were constantly wandering into the classrooms, looking around and distracting teachers and students from their work. This is an important lesson for us in the laity. Life in Christian institutions, and the home, the parish, the Christian school, it's for something. It has a purpose. It has a mission. We should be open to the world, inviting all to come share in our lives and what God has given to us, to enjoy what the Lord's bounty. But we have to take care not to allow those who want to disrupt our way of life to do so. To put it another way, if we see our journey through life as a pilgrimage, we cannot afford to let those we meet along the way and to whom we offer Christian hospitality and the invitation to join us to take us off the straight path. So let's stop and review for a moment. I've given you a diagnosis of the crisis of contemporary culture. Ours is a crisis that comes from a loss of sacred order and authority. Modern man has come to worship not God but himself. The project of modernity is to emancipate individual will from any constraints, religious or otherwise, on man's actions. In pursuing this goal, man has created an anti-culture, a culture that cannot do other than destroy the possibility of living stable and healthy lives together in community. We live, as I said, in liquid modernity, like the great flood of the Bible. I've given you a prescription of sorts for healing the brokenness caused by this crisis, and that prescription is the Benedictine life. To be sure, it is very strong medicine to enter a monastery or a convent. Most of us are not going to be called to that. But all of us Christians need to learn from the Benedictines how to recover a relationship to sacred order and to make it real in our own lives through our practices. In a sense, Benedictine monasteries are like those arks floating on the top of the waves of liquid modernity. We can't escape this flood, but we can ride it out without drowning if we create arks for ourselves through intentional Christian living in community. If we're going to stay true to our faith, we're going to have to listen to voices from outside the right here and right now, authoritative voices from the Christian past, especially in the pre-modern era. How else are we going to be able to tell the difference between those who speak comforting lies that we want to hear and those who, like the prophet Jeremiah, preach the authentic prophetic word of God? We must beware of religious leaders who are content to be chaplains to the contemporary cultural order. That way is spiritual death. Marco Seminarini is an Italian Catholic layman and a community leader who is one of the new and very different St. Benedicts of our time. When I visited his thriving, joyfully Orthodox Catholic community in Italy, I asked him how they did it. I mean, these guys, you see them, they are so happy. They are Orthodox in their faith, they know what they believe, and they're not angry about it. They're not bitter about it. Amazing. Marcus said to me, "We invented nothing. We discovered nothing. We are only rediscovering a tradition that was locked away inside an old box. We had forgotten." Well, modernity can be defined as a time of forced forgetting. The Benedict option is, in a sense, a project of preserving the memory of what it is to be Christian. Hope is memory plus desire. If we remember who we are and desire to make those memories live again, we have every reason to hope. But we can't ignore the warning that Father Cassian gave me when I visited. The monk told me that if Christian families and communities in the West do not do some form of the Benedict option, some form of communal countercultural living, then, quote, they're not going to make it. As I was finishing my book last year, a series of earthquakes struck the mountainous region of Italy where Norcia lies. The first ones in late August, last summer, damaged the monastery and the medieval basilica attached to it. Those monks saw the cracks in the walls and discerned that it wasn't safe to remain there, and they moved to safe ground on a mountainside just outside of the town. They set up tents and resumed their monastic life. On October 30th of last year, the largest earthquake to hit Italy in 3 decades struck just north of Norcia. It brought the Benedictine basilica tumbling to the ground and all but destroyed the monastery. The monks survived, however, because earlier that summer, they read the cracks in the plaster from the first earthquakes as handwriting on the wall and fled to safe ground. They didn't hide in the hills. They were just outside the town where they could still serve the townspeople, but they were on safe ground. In fact, not a single person in Norcia died on that day, despite the destruction, because nearly all the people in town had read the signs of the times and had done the same thing. Today, those monks, the Benedictine monks there, see the rubble of their basilica as a symbol of the church in the West. But they do not despair. Rather, they give thanks to God that He led them out of the town before the catastrophe and has spared them to rebuild. In fact, a couple weekends ago, I was speaking in Dallas at a fundraiser for the monks of Norcia for their new monastery, and the new prior, Father Benedict, told me that they've come to realize that as much of a shock as it was and a trial to their community to have to live through the collapse, they realized that this may have been a gift from God to save their community, because they didn't know how much living in the town on the piazza affected their lives in a negative way as monks. In other words, they needed the quiet and the isolation to be more faithful monks. So they see the destruction of everything that was around them as a gift from God for their own salvation. It's extraordinary, the faith these men have. They see the trial that they're living through as having universal significance, not just for them, but universal significance for all Christians in the West. The monks not only survived because they read the signs of the times, but because they also carried within their hearts, their minds, and in their bodies, sedimented into their bones, a resilient Christian faith that cannot be destroyed by earthquakes. It was a faith built up over years of prayer, worship, and faithful practice according to the rule of St. Benedict. There is indeed a profound lesson in that for all of us. Let us hear what the Spirit is saying unto the churches. Thank you.